Somewhere in your life, someone is watching you more closely than you realize. Not in an obvious way, not with open hostility, but with quiet curiosity, waiting for the moment you slip, waiting for the moment you react. Because the uncomfortable truth about human nature is this: reactions are revealing. They expose pressure points. They map your emotional weak spots like glowing markers in the dark. And the people who understand this, truly understand it, rarely raise their voices, rarely rush to defend themselves, and almost never explain more than necessary. Instead, they do something that feels deeply unnatural to most people. They remain still. They remain quiet. And when the moment demands it, they ignore. Most of us were not raised to operate this way. From childhood, you were likely taught that silence equals guilt, that explanation equals honesty, and that reacting quickly shows strength and confidence. If someone misunderstands you, you clarify. If someone challenges you, you defend your position. If someone disrespects you, you push back. On the surface, it sounds reasonable, even noble. But beneath the surface of social interaction, beneath the polite rules everyone pretends to follow, there is a much colder psychological game unfolding. And in that game, emotional restraint quietly outranks emotional expression almost every time. Niccolò Machiavelli understood something about human behavior that still makes people uncomfortable centuries later. He observed that people rarely judge you by your intentions. They judge you by what you display under pressure. And nothing is more revealing under pressure than the speed and intensity of your reaction. When you react impulsively, you don't just respond to the moment. You hand over information. You reveal what bothers you, what threatens you, what destabilizes you. It is a subtle surrender of control, and most people don't even realize they are doing it. Imagine a simple, familiar scenario. You're in a room with colleagues or acquaintances. Someone makes a comment that lightly questions your competence. It's not aggressive enough to call out directly, but it's sharp enough to create tension. In that moment, your body feels it before your mind fully processes it. The slight tightening in your chest, the quickening of your thoughts, the urge to correct the narrative immediately. Most people take the bait right there. They lean forward. They clarify. They explain what was meant, what was misunderstood, why the comment wasn't accurate. And the moment they do, something subtle shifts in the room. Not because they were wrong to defend themselves logically, but because emotionally, they've just shown where the pressure lands. Now imagine the same moment handled differently. The comment lands. You hear it clearly. You understand exactly what was implied. But instead of rushing to defend your image, you pause. You let a brief silence settle into the space. Maybe you offer a calm, almost indifferent acknowledgement. Or maybe you simply move the conversation forward without addressing it directly. What happens next is rarely obvious on the surface, but psychologically, the dynamic has changed. The person who expected friction doesn't get it. The small social trap they set doesn't spring, and suddenly the attention shifts, not toward your defense, but toward your composure. Human beings are deeply uncomfortable with emotional ambiguity. When people can't easily read your internal state, they begin to fill in the blanks themselves. This is one of the quiet powers of controlled silence. When you over-explain, you close the psychological loop for them. You remove uncertainty. But when you remain measured and selective with your responses, you create a space where others must interpret you carefully, and careful interpretation often leads to increased perceived weight. There is also a difficult truth most people resist accepting. The more urgently you try to manage how others perceive you, the more fragile your position can appear. Not always, and not in every context, but often enough that those who study human behavior begin to notice the pattern. High emotional urgency tends to signal that something important feels at stake internally, and observers, whether consciously or not, pick up on that signal. This is why individuals who appear calm under subtle pressure often carry an unspoken authority into the room. It is not about dominance in the loud, theatrical sense. It is about emotional steadiness in moments where others expect visible movement. Over time, people who practice this restraint begin to notice something else, something slightly unsettling. When you stop reacting to every small provocation, certain personalities begin to reveal themselves more clearly. The person who casually teased you before may push a little harder. The colleague who seemed mildly critical may grow more persistent. The acquaintance who thrived on back-and-forth tension may appear oddly frustrated when the usual emotional exchange doesn't occur. What you are witnessing in those moments is not random. It is the quiet exposure of underlying social motives. Some interactions were never really about communication. They were about emotional engagement. And when the engagement disappears, the true structure of the interaction becomes visible. This is where the philosophy behind never react, never explain, just ignore begins to show its darker edge. It is not about becoming cold or disconnected from the world. It is about recognizing that not every emotional invitation deserves your participation. Some comments are fishing lines cast into the water, waiting for movement. Some criticisms are less about improvement and more about repositioning status. Some misunderstandings resolve themselves naturally when you don't rush to correct them with visible urgency. The discipline lies in learning to distinguish between moments that require thoughtful response and moments that quietly reward restraint. There is a particular kind of strength that develops when you become comfortable with being briefly misunderstood. Most people cannot tolerate it. The discomfort drives them to clarify immediately, to smooth the tension, to restore clarity as fast as possible. But those who study social dynamics closely notice that immediate clarity is not always strategically necessary. Sometimes, time itself reshapes perception. Sometimes, consistent behavior speaks louder than rapid explanation. And sometimes, silence allows weak accusations or shallow provocations to collapse under their own weight. Of course, this approach requires emotional discipline that most people never fully develop. It is far easier to react. Reacting feels active. It feels like taking control. But paradoxically, constant reaction often places you in a responsive position rather than a directive one. You are moving because something else moved first. You are explaining because someone else created doubt. You are defending because someone else applied pressure. Over time, this pattern can quietly train others to expect access to your emotional state on demand. Contrast that with the individual who remains composed more often than not, the one who listens fully before speaking, the one who does not rush to clean up every minor misunderstanding, the one who treats their attention and emotional energy as limited resources rather than unlimited supplies. There is a subtle gravity that begins to form around that person. Conversations with them feel slightly more measured. Challenges directed at them tend to be more cautious. Even casual observers start to sense that provoking a quick emotional reaction from this person is unusually difficult. This does not mean silence is always the correct move. Machiavellian thinking was never about rigid rules applied blindly. It was about reading the terrain carefully. There are moments where clear, direct communication is necessary and wise. There are situations where silence can be misinterpreted in damaging ways. But what most people never learn is the middle ground, the calibrated response, the ability to choose reaction instead of being pulled into it automatically, the ability to explain when it serves a purpose and to remain quiet when explanation would only dilute perceived confidence. As you move through your own daily interactions, you may begin to notice how often small emotional hooks are placed into ordinary conversations. A dismissive tone here, a subtle challenge there, a passive-aggressive remark that is just ambiguous enough to provoke correction. Once you start seeing these moments, they become difficult to ignore. And the real shift begins not when you suppress your emotions completely, but when you create a small space between the stimulus and your response, a pause that most people skip, a breath that interrupts the automatic reaction. In that space, you regain something most people give away without realizing it: choice. And choice, in the landscape of human power dynamics, is everything. That small space, the pause between what happens to you and how you respond, is where the real shift begins to take shape. Most people never notice it because their reactions are so tightly wired to their emotions that the two feel inseparable. Something happens, and the response follows instantly, almost mechanically. But once you begin to slow that moment down, even slightly, you start to see the machinery underneath human interaction. You begin to notice how often people are not simply communicating, they are testing, probing, measuring your stability the way fingers press gently against ice to see if it will crack. And when you stop cracking on cue, something deeply interesting happens. At first, the change is subtle. Conversations that used to escalate quickly begin to flatten. People who once pushed your buttons with casual ease start adjusting their tone around you. Not always consciously. Most of this unfolds below the level of deliberate awareness. But the shift is there. Human beings are extremely sensitive to emotional feedback loops. When someone expects resistance and receives calm neutrality instead, their internal prediction model falters. The rhythm they were unconsciously relying on disappears. And when rhythm disappears, uncertainty quietly enters the room. Uncertainty is powerful because it makes people cautious. This is one of the darker psychological advantages of mastering restraint. Not because you are trying to manipulate every interaction, but because predictability is one of the easiest ways for others to gain leverage over you. If someone knows exactly how to provoke you, exactly how to draw you into defensive explanations, exactly how to make you emotionally visible on command, then, without realizing it, you have given them a map. And maps make people easier to navigate, easier to anticipate, easier to corner. But when your responses become measured, selective, and sometimes deliberately absent, that map begins to blur. Consider a moment most people experience at some point. Someone sends you a message that carries a sharp edge, not openly hostile, but clearly designed to stir something. Maybe it questions your judgment. Maybe it carries that familiar tone of subtle disrespect. Your first instinct is immediate engagement, to clarify, to correct, to set the record straight. Your fingers may even hover over the keyboard, ready to type out the perfect response that will restore balance. This is the moment where discipline quietly separates itself from impulse. Because sometimes, the most stabilizing move is not the clever reply you were about to send. Sometimes, the most disarming response is the absence of one. When the expected emotional exchange fails to appear, the psychological weight often shifts back toward the person who initiated the tension. Hours pass, then more time, and slowly, a quiet discomfort can begin to build on the other side of the interaction. Not always. Human behavior is never perfectly predictable, but often enough that those who practice this consistently start to notice the pattern repeating. What makes this approach particularly uncomfortable for many people is that it runs directly against the social conditioning most of us were given. You were likely taught that maturity means addressing every issue head-on, that confidence means always having an answer ready, that strength means never letting a challenge go unanswered. And there is truth in those lessons. In the right contexts, but the world Machiavelli observed, and the one we still inhabit, is layered with more nuance than those simple rules account for. Not every comment is a good faith invitation to clarify. Not every criticism is meant to improve you. Not every misunderstanding requires immediate correction. Sometimes, engagement is exactly what fuels the dynamic. This is where emotional economy becomes an advanced skill. When you begin to treat your attention, your explanations, and your reactions as limited resources rather than automatic reflexes, your entire social presence starts to feel different. You become less hurried in your responses, less eager to close every small loop of tension, less available to low-level provocation. And paradoxically, this often increases the weight of the moments when you do choose to speak clearly and directly, because selective voices carry further than constant noise. There is also a deeper internal shift that begins to take place, one that has less to do with how others see you and more to do with how stable you feel within yourself. When you stop reacting to every small emotional ripple around you, your nervous system gradually learns that not every external stimulus requires internal turbulence. The world feels slightly quieter, slightly slower. You begin to notice things you used to miss because your attention is no longer constantly pulled outward by every minor friction point. This is where the philosophy moves beyond strategy and begins to touch something more personal. Because at its core, the discipline of never react, never explain, just ignore, is not really about controlling other people. It is about reclaiming control over your own emotional bandwidth. It is about deciding, consciously and deliberately, what deserves your energy and what does not. And when that decision becomes more refined, something else begins to emerge. Clarity. You start to see which interactions in your life are built on mutual respect and which ones quietly depend on emotional volatility. You start to notice who becomes more grounded around your calm and who becomes increasingly agitated when they cannot easily pull you into familiar patterns. Neither reaction needs to be judged harshly, but both are revealing in ways that are difficult to unsee once the pattern becomes clear. There is a quiet confidence that grows in people who master this balance. Not the loud, performative kind of confidence that demands attention, but the steadier kind that comes from knowing you are no longer emotionally available on demand. Your reactions are no longer reflexive. Your explanations are no longer automatic. Your silence, when it appears, is no longer accidental. It is chosen. And choice, sustained over time, reshapes presence. If there is one final truth Machiavelli understood, one that still unsettles people today, it is that human beings constantly reveal more through their emotional patterns than through their words. The person who must always react is easier to steer. The person who must always explain is easier to pressure. But the individual who can remain composed in moments where others expect visible movement becomes, slowly and quietly, more difficult to read. Not invisible, not untouchable, but less easily influenced. So the next time you feel that familiar pull, the urge to correct immediately, to defend instantly, to step into every small emotional challenge that crosses your path, pause long enough to ask yourself a different question than the one most people ask. Not, how do I respond to this? But, does this truly deserve a response from me at all? Because sometimes the most powerful shift in any interaction happens in the moment you decide, calmly, deliberately, and without drama, to let the silence speak for you.